Merkel Media.
I'm exhausted, looking for everything in the shadows. Start looking at people like they don't matter. I'm waking up to the fact, more than a little bit shallow. I'm lost in this hole, but I don't wanna. I'm lost in this hole, 'cause I'm just trying to
What's up, guys? We are back with another episode, and I am excited about this episode this week. I've actually talked about this subject before in the past, maybe 2-3 years ago, but I've never gone into this much depth with it. And I started revisiting some of the research I'd done before. I found quite a few more things to add to it. And I think that I've put together a pretty compelling presentation about this particular character. It's going to be a two-parter, just so you guys know. So part one will be today, and then next Monday will be part two. And we're going to talk about the original Jeffrey Epstein, Hugh Hefner. And Hefner's a very interesting person. And I am excited to get into who he was, what he represented, and what he was actually doing behind the scenes. Because what he represented on the surface was far different than what he was actually doing behind the scenes. And I want to preface this for any of the little ears out there that this might not be the show for them. So while I keep my shows very clean and not explicit on that level, just the subject matter today and especially next week will probably be a little too much unless they're older and they understand these types of topics, because Hugh Hefner was involved with a lot of sordid nastiness behind the scenes. And I believe that he laid the groundwork for guys like Jeffrey Epstein and P. Diddy. And I think that they, along with many others, modeled what they wanted to promote after what Hugh Hefner himself represented. And I know he's passed away now, and I am going to suggest in part two that there's more to that too. And I'm going to show you why I think there's more to his death than what's being said as in old age and some of these other things. He was definitely preparing for something to happen. And we'll talk a little bit about that today, about a particular part of him. But some of this is based on a docuseries that came out in 2022 of January called Secrets of Playboy. It's a 10-part docuseries on A&E. You can find it streaming. I'm not sure exactly where now, but you can find it streaming out there. It might be Hulu or Netflix. I'm not really sure. But go check it out. If you just type in Secrets of Playboy, it's very interesting. They gathered, I think it was around 30 former Playmates and people who worked for Playboy during the time that Hugh Hefner was there. And a lot of info came out about what he was doing. And I think it goes far deeper than just that documentary, which we're going to really go deep on part 2 when we start getting into monarch programming in specific in conjunction with the CIA. And we're going to get into some of the nastier aspects of underage women and some of those things in part 2. We'll touch on a little bit here, but today's going to be more about setting the tone, talking about what some of these women said was being done. I'm going to talk about some of the clubs that he set up, these VIP clubs that he set up. We're also going to get into the occult pretty heavy on the back end of today's episode. So this is where we're really going to get into what I think that Hugh Hefner was involved in behind the scenes, because a lot of these guys promote this image, this free love lifestyle, but behind the scenes, they're involved with practices and things that they're not showcasing out front. You know, some celebrities of any kind, whether it's sports or entertainment, as far as movies or music, or if they're in politics, they may not overtly promote the occult, while some of them do in symbolism. Sometimes some of them don't. Now, I do think that I'll showcase today where there is some symbolism, where we get into the deeper occult part of those connections with Hugh Hefner, but I don't think he was super overt with that part of his life. And I think that a lot of the sordidness that is on the surface as a part of this documentary is bad enough, right? But once we start getting into the occult symbolism, and then, of course, next episode after this one in part 2, we're going to get really into monarch programming and talk about his connections with the CIA. And that will really bring this part and that part together to show that he was indeed the original Jeffrey Epstein. And he set the tone for a lot of guys like that to operate in the celebrity space, where they could blackmail people to be able to move and shake the way they wanted to on that scene. Hey guys, before we get back into the show, I just want to let people know who have been asking how they can donate to the show to help with the show's growth. You can become a member here on YouTube. There are 3 different tiers. There is Nephilim Portal Babies, there is Nephilim Hunter, and Good Nephilim. Each one of them have a few different things that come along with them, but the one thing that comes with all of them is custom emojis that you can use in the live chats and in the comments below. I really appreciate all the love you guys have been showing. And listen, if you can't become a member, just you donating your time is one of the best gifts that you can give this channel. For now, let's get back into the show. And when you get to Hugh Hefner, a lot of people looked at him as an idol. I remember early on when I started with music that Hugh Hefner was what everyone wanted to be, including myself. You looked at this guy who built up an entire lifestyle around having multiple women, basically a harem of women, and he did it legally, at least on the surface, right? Legally. He built an empire doing that, and he was the Playboy. That's where the idea of the Playboy comes from, is the lifestyle that the magazine and the man promoted. And so many rappers and sports athletes were friends with him. They really wanted to be him. There were songs and artists who specifically talked about him. We know Lil Wayne talked about him in God Bless America, French Montana, featuring The Weeknd on Gifted, 50 Cent, Hustler's Ambition, Migos, Cross the Country, and even U2 had a song called The Playboy Mansion. I know it's a double meaning as far as what the song means, but on the surface, it was definitely about the Playboy Mansion. It's not like those guys weren't going there too. And you got to think that the pornography industry was nothing like it is now, where it's so easily accessible. And so when he came along, he started this whole sexual revolution. And when you hear him in interviews, he's super intelligent. And the way that he presents it, like it's a good thing. Women need to liberate themselves. Women need to allow their sexuality to showcase their freedom. But in actuality, he was creating a culture, a lifestyle of manipulation, and also creating a lifestyle where these women felt like they were in prison in the Playboy Mansion, which some of them specifically say. Even the media, to some extent, because you had some people in the media that couldn't stand him. They tried to take him down. As a matter of fact, we'll talk today specifically about the drugs that were running in and out of the mansion and all these parties and these clubs that he had where the FBI was trying to take him down too. So you did have media that was, but then you had this other side of the media that was highly promoting him, that he was this feminist dude. He was empowering women and he was giving them the keys, the access to be their greater selves. And I think that carried all the way over into guys like Jeffrey Epstein and Diddy, which we talked about. So I think that he was the precursor to what is really deep behind the scenes in the entertainment industry now. And not to say that the entertainment industry hasn't always had some sort of underbelly to it, even before him. But I think that the way he did it created a map or a model for a lot of these other guys who came along after him. Now, Hugh Hefner, he was born in 1926. He was an American magazine publisher. He was the founder and editor-in-chief of Playboy magazine. It was a publication with revealing photographs and articles. And he also extended this Playboy brand to a world network of Playboy Clubs. He also resided in luxury mansions where Playboy Playmates shared his wild partying life. And it fueled a lot of media interest, including the eyes of other celebrities, which many of them frequented his mansion. Some of them had what they considered their own rooms there, where they would just come and stay for weeks on end. I know Leonardo DiCaprio was one of the big ones that used to go there all the time, but he's just one name. I mean, you could name pretty much anybody who was big since Hugh Hefner started all of these VIP clubs and eventually the Playboy Mansion. Many of them were involved, and some of them involved in some very illegal acts, which we will talk about a little today, and definitely on part two. Specifically, we will talk about Bill Cosby and some of the things he was involved in, because he was closely connected to Hugh Hefner and the Playboy Mansion and a lot of the Playmates as well. So Hefner was born in Chicago, and his mother was of Swedish ancestry and his father was of German and English. He was also the descendant of Plymouth Governor William Bradford through his father's line. And William Bradford was an English Puritan separatist originally from the West Riding of Yorkshire in northern England. He moved to Leyden in the Dutch Republic in order to escape persecution from King James I of England, and then immigrated to the Plymouth colony on the Mayflower in 1620. He was a signatory to the Mayflower Compact and went on to serve as governor of the Plymouth colony intermittently for 30 years between 1621 and 1657. He served as a commissioner of the United Colonies of New England on multiple occasions and served twice as president. So William Bradford was integral in basically helping create the United States. So Hugh Hefner came from this line. Also, later on this episode, I'm going to talk about a couple of major figureheads that he's also related to, that you'll know their names very well. And you'll also know many conspiracies that surround these key figureheads in American history, and how it's very interesting that Hugh Hefner comes from a lineage of early founding fathers and presidents, which we'll talk about later. So I find that fascinating. And you will see that sometimes with some of these key figures in entertainment, where if you track their lineage, they're very connected to some of these elite bloodlines. And I will suggest later, possibly, there will be some Nephilim connections to this too. And I'll explain why. And that will be more speculative, but I will show where the correlations do exist, and then you can make your own decision about that. He described his family as conservative Midwestern Methodist, and his mother actually wanted him to become a missionary. And clearly, he didn't become a missionary, but he was very conservative and straight-laced early on. And I'm going to show you the big catalyst that changed his whole outlook on women, changed his whole outlook on conservatism when something very earth-shattering happened to him in his marriage. So Hefner attended Sayre Elementary School and Steinmetz High School, and then served in the United States Army from 1944 to 1946 as a writer for a military newspaper. So that's where he started getting his chops in writing, because Hugh Hefner was a fantastic writer. And he joined the war effort during World War II, and that was just 7 years before he created Playboy magazine from his kitchen table, which we'll get into in a little bit. He served as an infantry clerk, and he drew cartoons for various military newspapers. And even though he enlisted during World War II, Hugh Hefner actually never saw any action. He never actually fought in war. But this is also interesting. This made me think of Aleister Crowley's connection to being a secret agent a little bit, because we talked about that on the very first episode that I talked about Crowley being a secret agent, how he talked about his training as a sharpshooter and how he was amazing with artillery. Well, Hugh Hefner was also in the same boat there. During basic training, he won a sharpshooter badge for firing the N1 and made it through Killer College, in which troops went through maneuvers while throwing real grenades. He posted at Camp Ader in Salem, Oregon, and Camp Pickett in Virginia. And in 1946, Hefner was honorably discharged from the Army and went on to attend art classes at the University of Illinois. And later on in life, he was asked about what he thought about his time in the Army during World War II. And he said, and I quote, "I came out like a lot of other fellows, believing that somehow we had fought in a war, the last really moral war, and that we would celebrate that in some form." He went on to share his disillusionment with the post-war years. All we got was a lot of conformity and conservatism. It was the time of the House on American Activities Committee and the time of McCarthyism. It had a big impact on me. And for people that need a refresher on McCarthyism, which I've talked about on the show, was also known as the Second Red Scare. And it was the political repression and persecution of left-wing individuals in a campaign spreading fear of communist and Soviet influence on American institutions and of Soviet espionage in the United States during the late 1940s through the 1950s. And it's attributed to the mid-1950s U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy, who spearheaded the campaign. But as things started being revealed, when it came to a lot of this stuff was a witch hunt, and they were using it as a catalyst to either lock people up or get them out of the country who they didn't like, who pushed back against the government. That's one thing you got to understand about politics. And I know that there's probably people listening to the show now that are either left-wing or right-wing. I am apolitical. I've said this on the show before. I have a very different viewpoint on politics than most people, and I do talk about it some on the show. It's not particularly my favorite thing to talk about. It's just super toxic, and it just creates an environment where people just attack each other. There's really no middle ground. People aren't looking for that anymore. People are just looking to squabble online or for politics. And I really don't like to contribute to that. However, if I do feel like that I want to talk about something in that particular field, I will. And if it's something that's important to me, or if I feel led to talk about it, I absolutely will. But the point I'm making is that the right at the time were the big bad. And a lot of people on the left were fighting that system. However, there was a lot of bad people on the left too. And I think that's just generally how it is on both sides in the political spectrum. I think you have definitely some bad people on both sides. I know people like to attribute two wings on the same bird, a very classic Native American phrase, which I do to some degree agree with that. However, I think there's a lot of nuances as well. I don't think everybody that's involved with politics is evil. However, I think that there are definitely people in the upper positions that are manipulated. And sometimes they would be what I consider blind idiots, right? They're being manipulated without them even knowing it. They may even think they're doing the right thing. So I don't think everybody's just some mastermind in politics. Far from it. I think the real movers and shakers are people that are involved in major corporations and some of these elite families, which you may never know their names. And I think that's where we really generally need to point to when it comes to the manipulation of the political scene. But back to this McCarthyism, it's funny. In later years, the more research that people started doing, they realized that Joseph McCarthy may not have had near as much to do with McCarthyism. As a matter of fact, it was more so J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI at the time, and some people have suggested it should actually be called Hooverism. So I think that's probably more in line because the FBI at that point in time was really at the forefront of trying to control free speech, trying to make sure people did it and said what they wanted them to do. And Hoover was a big part of that. And funny enough, though, something else that was found out later, because initially when McCarthyism entered, it entered because they realized that a lot of the stuff was unfounded, why these people were being locked up. That's true to those people that were being locked up and pushed out for the most part, unless we're talking about like Shin Shuzen, who literally was writing in his papers, comrades. He was definitely a communist. So some people did, but for the most part, it was a lot of people that didn't deserve it. But there were documents that came out at the end of the Cold War that revealed substantial Soviet spy activity in the United States, though many of the agents were never properly identified by Senator McCarthy or anybody that was involved in this second Red Scare. So that's an interesting piece, too, that we have to think about when it comes to McCarthyism, that it really was to silence the people they wanted to silence, but they let the actual Soviet spy activity go on because they could have been involved themselves. Maybe they were tracking those spies to either flip them or follow the breadcrumbs back to where it came from. There's a lot of reasons, but it's funny how most of the Soviet spies never got locked up, the actual ones. It was more so the people that they wanted to silence. And in this particular environment, it was the right that was trying to silence people on the left, which you'll see this in swings, right, in politics. It's the pendulum. I call it the pendulum. It's going to swing so hard one way that everybody's going to push back, and then it's going to swing super hard this way. And then everybody's going to push back, and then it's going to swing super hard this way again. It's what's happening right now because everything's swung so far left to the point of idiocracy that now it's swinging so far right that we're going to meet another version of idiocracy. So there's no balance. There's no people trying to work together, try to understand each other, try to understand that we're all people in different environments, in different positions in life. And that's why I preach on this show, love and compassion, and how we need to be able to connect to each other, because that's how we actually figure out what's going on and we can move forward as communities. Because here's the best part. We're all human beings and we all have thoughts and processes that are different than everyone else. So I may read something that you read and we may get something completely different out of it, but that doesn't mean we have to hate each other over it. Now, granted, there are people that do despicable things on both sides of politics, but those are the people that we can point to and say, well, that person is just being absolutely ludicrous in how they're portraying this, but that's not representation of the whole. And I look at that with politics very much, where I start looking at individuals more so than actual party systems, because party systems are designed to keep us fighting each other. That's really what it boils down to. And I don't think that there's anything really fantastic that comes out of politics, especially in this day and age of social media. I mean, good Lord, that's all people do. I see online, and I really just try to stay away from a lot of it outside of information that I need for research or just information I'm trying to keep up with, because, yeah, we all need to be informed, right? We all need to try to understand what's going on around us, but it shouldn't rule our lives. And politics just absolutely rules so many people's lives. It makes them so angry, so mad. And that's not how we're supposed to live at all. We shouldn't. And if we allow that to control us, just like anything else, we're never going to live full lives. So Hefner, after his military service, he studied at the Chicago Art Institute, University of Illinois, which we talked about. In addition to art and psychology, Hefner studied sociology, including Alfred Kinsey's Sex Research Institute. In 1948, Hefner wrote a college paper on Kinsey's report on the American male. And it's funny because he got an A for his research, but then he got a B- on his conclusions because he pushed back on a lot of Kinsey's work. And this was part of the catalyst that moved him into creating Playboy. Now, before we get to Playboy being created, we need to talk about what was the thing that flipped Hugh Hefner into becoming the man he is now. Well, we'll talk about it. It was his first marriage. So Hugh vowed to save himself for his childhood sweetheart, Mildred Millie Williams, until they got married. So he meets her before he goes to the army. He goes to the army. He saves himself. He's a virgin. He hasn't had sex with anybody. So he gets back. They're engaged. Obviously, while he was gone away, they were unengaged. He gets back. They're setting up his marriage. But just days before their wedding, Williams revealed that she had slept with someone else while he was in the military. And Hugh Hefner says, and I quote, "I had literally saved myself from my wife, but after we had sex, she told me that she had an affair. That was the most devastating moment in my life." He actually said that any time that he had relations with her, that he would view other men being with her, and that really bothered him. So despite all this, they still got married in 1949. They had 2 kids. They had daughter Christy Hefner, who ended up being the CEO of Playboy, and David, who was high up in the IT sector, including Silicon Valley and some of those things. So his children were an integral part of helping with his empire as it got bigger. So the betrayal just looms over him and over the marriage, to the point that Williams gave her husband permission to be with other women. So that changed his entire outlook on the institution of marriage and sexuality. And she made a deal with him because she felt so bad about what she did that she's like, "Hey, whatever you do's on the house. You can have an open relationship. It's one way, so you can do whatever you want." So he agrees to it. And he even said it's not necessarily what he wanted, but he agreed to it because of how he felt so bad about what she had done. And they stayed married for 10 years, and she actually helped him in the early stages of building his empire. But again, once you're off the leash like that and you start doing whatever, and he just becomes this mogul, and he starts building into this character, this Hugh Hefner character, this Playboy character who's running around having all these women, but he wants to find a way to market it, right? This is going to be part of where he starts moving into this grooming aspect of bringing these women in, creating this lifestyle that they want to be a part of. But to also be a part of that lifestyle, you have to do all of these things in secret, which we'll talk about today. So in January of 1952, Hefner left his job as a copywriter for Esquire after he was denied a $5 raise. In 1953, he took out a mortgage loan of $600, and then he raised $8,000 from 45 investors, and his mother actually gave him $1,000 too. And he said she didn't even believe in what he was doing, but she believed in him. So he was doing all this to launch Playboy, the first magazine, the first issue. It was originally going to be called Stag Party, but he ended up naming it Playboy. In December of 1953, he put out his first issue, which featured Marilyn Monroe, and there were nude pictures of her for the first time showcased. However, these pictures were taken way before. He actually purchased them. Now, the first issue sold more than 50,000 copies, but Monroe wasn't paid for any of it. This was kind of to just help her career at the time. It helped Playboy be executed. It's hard to think that there wasn't possibly other people at play here too to make Playboy a thing. We had 45 other investors involved. We don't know the nuances behind the scenes. Was there some sort of machine behind this that thought that Hugh Hefner would be the perfect person to run this type of operation? Some of that shouldn't be speculative. We don't really know. And the funny part was Hugh Hefner never met Marilyn Monroe. He just purchased the photos. And what's interesting, though, when he died, he was buried next to her because he had purchased the crypt next to hers in Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery. He did that in 1992. So he looked at her as a major piece of him building his empire because, you know, she was kind of the hot new thing coming up. And then he released nude photos of her that, you know, for that time period, people went insane for. So that was a big part of launching Hugh Hefner into being who he ended up being. Now, Marilyn Monroe, for people that don't know, she was an American actress and model known for playing cosmic blonde bombshell characters. She became one of the most popular sex symbols of the 1950s and early 1960s, as well as an emblem of the era's sexual revolution. She was a top-billed actress for a decade, and her films grossed $200 million, which would be the equivalent of $2 billion today by her death in 1962. And we know of a lot of people that she was involved with, presidents. There were so many different actors that she was involved with. Interestingly enough, we're not doing an episode on Marilyn Monroe today, but the more I was digging, that her mother was just an absolute wreck, right? Her mother was just a wreck. Now, she ended up having her daughter by an actor, Charles Stanley Gifford, which was in secret. So when Marilyn got older, she actually reached out, and she talks about this in her book, how she reached out to Charles Stanley Gifford and told him who she was. And she didn't want any money from him, nothing like that. She just wanted him to respond. And he literally says, I'm married. I have a family. I don't have anything to say to you. Call my lawyer. So he wanted nothing to do with her. Even after she came forward and said, hey, by the way, I'm actually your real kid. He said, no, that whole thing with your mom was an accident. Anyway, that was in secret. But her mother was such a wreck, and she actually was in the mental institute for a while. And one of the interesting things, and this plays into MK Ultras, plays into Monarch programming, that her mother, before she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and had to go to a rest home or a mental state hospital, they were living with actors George and Maude Atkinson. And what's interesting about that, when she was staying alone with them while her mother was staying at Metropolitan State Hospital, she was actually abused by them during this time. So she was getting SA'd by this husband and wife who were actors in Hollywood. So this kind of sets that tone that even the first model of Playboy was part of this sexual abuse that we have talked about many times when it comes to people who become famous as children. They're groomed into this lifestyle, and then by the time they're older, they just think that it's what they're supposed to do. And it's really sad. And again, a lot of the things we're going to talk about in these two episodes are going to be disturbing because it is a just cesspool of manipulation and control over women in a way that's some of the most despicable behavior that you could possibly do to people. So the magazine takes off. It's becoming this force of nature at this point. So as it's getting bigger, Hugh Hefner starts getting more eyes on him. Not all of them great when it comes to the government, because you got to think about this is a pretty conservative time period where pornography was illegal in a lot of ways, and he was pushing the limits of that. And he actually got arrested in 1963 for promoting obscene literature because he published an issue of Playboy featuring naked shots of Jane Mansfield in bed with a man present. So they went to trial. There was a hung jury. He ended up skating on the whole thing. So in these 1960s, though, is when he created these private key clubs. And one of the things that was interesting about them, they were racially diverse. So he was one of the first guys to really push the limits of having Black women worked there. Black men were invited there, not just Black people, but of any race. So he created this environment, this liberal environment of a lot of different races that were allowed to participate together, which in essence made him look from the outside like he was very groundbreaking. He's very progressive in that way. And that part, there's nothing wrong with, but what he was doing to bring them together was completely wrong. And the Playboy Club or clubs were a chain of nightclubs and resorts owned and operated by Playboy Enterprises. The first Playboy Club opened up in Chicago in 1960. So this is where he's from. He wants to put a first key club there. As a matter of fact, he had his first quote-unquote mansion there, too. It's nothing like it was when he moved out to California, but this is where it all started, was here in Chicago. And the way that it was set up, you had a living room, a Playmate bar, a dining room, and a club room. Members and their guests were served food and drinks by Playboy bunnies, some of whom were featured in Playboy magazine. And the way that it was set up, you had these levels to it. So if you were in that upper tier VIP section, you were offered a lot more. And just read between the lines what I mean by a lot more when it came to what the Playmates would offer, because what they would say was, if you weren't part of this VIP, you were not allowed to touch, you were not allowed to interact with the Playmates in any kind of way, any of the Playboy bunnies who were serving you. But if you were in the VIP and you were this upper echelon celebrity, it was encouraged. As a matter of fact, Hefner told the Playboy bunnies to essentially service those type of men. And this is something that he pushed throughout his whole life when it came to that elite world of elite celebrity figures in politics, sports, or entertainment of any kind. And a big part of these VIP clubs was not only the quote-unquote favors these girls were offering, but it was also a place where drugs just freely moved in and out of these clubs. And specifically, Quaaludes, or methaqualone, which is a hypnotic sedative. It was sold under the brand names Quaalude and Soper, among others, which contained 300 milligrams of methaqualone, and sold as a combination drug under the brand name Mandrix, which contained 250 milligrams of methaqualone within the same tablet, mostly in Europe. The commercial production of methaqualone was halted in the mid-1980s due to widespread abuse and addictiveness. And you'll hear a lot about Quaaludes when it comes to 80s movies and 70s movies. If you ever remember Scarface, Tony Montana talked specifically about Quaaludes a lot in that film. So that was very much a 70s, 80s thing. And it was part of the celebrity lifestyle, too, in real life. So Quaaludes were moving in and out of these Playboy clubs. And we're going to talk about some of the things that happened to some of these women due to Quaaludes. So you had Quaaludes, you had cocaine running in and out of these clubs. And as a matter of fact, and we'll talk about this specifically as we get deeper in this part of the episode, but Hugh Hefner specifically called Quaaludes thigh openers. And he would tell the girls that before he gave it to them to prep them for what was going to happen later on that evening or even within the next hour or two with not only him, but other men that he brought in to the Playboy Mansion or clubs or whatever else. So again, this was part of prepping these women and controlling these women by forcing them essentially to have relations with not only himself, but many other celebrities during that time. This is when we get into some of his ex-girlfriends like Holly Madison and Sandra Theodore and Bunny Mother, PJ Maston, and you'll keep hearing their names as we go throughout this episode, along with many others, because they have many stories about what happened to them while they were either working for or they were Playboy Playmates or girlfriends of Hugh Hefner during this time period. And Theodore actually reveals that there was so much group sex at the mansion, like 5 nights a week, and said that they were basically breaking the women in like horses, which is disturbing enough. And also at these VIP clubs, the members of the Playboy nightclubs would do as they pleased, including the revered Soul Train host Don Cornelius, who allegedly held 2 playmates hostage and assaulted one of them. And that was according to the docuseries. So go check that out. And if you don't know who Donald Cornelius is, he was an American television host and producer, widely known for his creator of the nationally syndicated dance and music show Soul Train, which he hosted from 1970 until 1993, which I remember Soul Train growing up, even though I didn't get all of it, but I remember it in the 80s. I remember the early 90s. And he was also inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He actually did have some arrest charges at one point. He was charged with spousal abuse and dissuading a witness. And he was also banned from going near his estranged wife, Russian model Victoria Alva Cornelius. Victoria Chapman is her maiden name. And he also obtained 2 restraining orders against himself. He did plead no contest and was placed on 36 months of probation. So I'm just giving a little bit of reference point there that he did have some legal troubles. Now, according to the docuseries that I was talking about, the women that said this happened in the 1970s said they were brought to Cornelius' house for a 3-day period where they were locked in separate rooms, bound, drugged, and assaulted. Now, of course, family members of Cornelius come out and say it's absolutely not true. There's no way. Of course, they're going to say that. And sometimes they would never know about any of this kind of behavior. People that do this kind of stuff are very good at hiding it. And you look at serial killers like Ted Bundy, you meet him on the one hand, he's very charismatic. He is very intoxicating. There were plenty of women that he was with that he never assaulted. And then on the other hand, he's this diabolical person who's assaulting women and murdering them and ditching their bodies all over America. So I don't put it past anyone. I don't put it past family members not to know about stuff their family members do. He actually offed himself in February 1st of 2012. The police were called to Cornelius' home, and they heard reports of shooting. He had a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He was taken to the medical center, and then he died at the age of 75. Now, they said that he had congenital deformity in his brain and said that he was suffering seizures, which could be a possibility. He could have been suffering seizures and flipped out. Also, he could have been living with a lot of guilt for things that he's done. That happens to people when they get older. They start thinking about all the awful things they've done, and he may have been at that point. Also, he could have been getting ready to squeal on some things that he knew, and there's that possibility too. And I'm going to suggest that heavily with Hugh Hefner at the end of episode 2, and I'm going to show you how I get there in episode 2. But let's not put any of those things out of the realm of possibility. Obviously, all of it's speculative. We don't really know anything outside of the fact that he did shoot himself and he passed away. But we do know that he was accused by former bunnies that he kidnapped them, had them locked up for 3 days while he's assaulting them. And this is going to be a theme that you're going to see consistently as we're digging deeper and deeper into Hugh Hefner and the people around him. So to Hugh Hefner, we're talking about drugs because he on the outside would say, oh, I didn't do any drugs. He never have any part of it. He was, a clean man when it came to that kind of stuff. But every day he drank 30 bottles of Coca-Cola. He ate jelly beans all day. And we also know when it comes to candy and sugar, there's a huge connection to drugs because consuming sugar triggers the release of dopamine in the brain and it creates a pleasurable sensation. And it reinforces the desire for more sugar. And you'll see people that are high on specifically any kind of speed, right? Meth, cocaine, or pills like Ritalin, which they call baby coke, anything like that. You'll see people eat a lot of candy with. They'll want a lot of sugar with that. And you'll see people that are trying to come off those drugs get really addicted to sugar because they'll supplement it with another addiction. So that's a pretty big red flag when it comes to was Hugh Hefner doing drugs too. I have a hard time thinking that he didn't do any drugs, any Quaalude, any cocaine, anything like that, considering it was just super rampant around him most of his life, especially at these parties. So I do think that, in my opinion, he was probably hooked on something, considering that even the playmates around him talked about he didn't really eat a lot of food. He just drank a lot of Coca-Cola. He ate a lot of jelly beans. He wasn't a big eater. And if you see him in pictures, he was a pretty skinny dude most of his life. And he didn't have the reputation as being a big eater. So I'm just putting two and two together there. I know there's not a lot of info out there about him personally doing drugs. If anything, he's tried to distance himself most of his life from that. And I think that was by design. I think that he wanted all the drugs around him, but he distanced himself personally from being involved with it, at least on the surface of what people would see from the outside about him. And to get to the VIP clubs again, there was a lot of craziness going on there. Now, one of the things that he started early on, and he continued throughout his entire life, was what he called a rating system. He wanted women to be 9s or 10s in this rating system, and he and his friends kept this rating system. So you need to be a 9, preferably a 10, to become an actual playmate, especially to move into the mansion. That was a big deal. To become one of his girlfriends was even higher up on the chart. And he would pit the women against each other by saying that, oh, this girl said this about you, or she has this better than you have, or he would downplay a woman's beauty to make them augment themselves. He did this all the time. That was part of his manipulation and control. And he did that in all of his interviews when he brought women in, all the way back to the VIP clubs, all the way through the Playboy Mansion days, even to become a playmate. All of that was an important part of it. Also, as a part of the VIP club structure, there were several incidents of women being drugged, being assaulted, and instead of finding the person who did it, they would actually fire the women, and they would tell the staff, don't talk about it. Don't let anybody know about it. So when we'll talk about cleanup crews later, but the cleanup crews were more a part of the Playboy Mansion, but they essentially had cleanup crews the entire time that he was operating under this Playboy banner, whether it was VIP clubs or whether it was off-site parties, which we'll also talk about, which gets really seedy there. These quote-unquote pig parties that they used to host. I mean, it gets really down a very dark rabbit hole of what he was involved with, because he wasn't this promoter of a free lifestyle like he presented. He was actually building a structure of control and manipulation, and for these women to be objects for men in power to do whatever they wanted with. And we'll get to one of the Playmate stories here, which was also a part of episode 4 of the 10-part docuseries Secrets of Playboy. But her name was Adrienne Pollock. And it's important because the FBI got involved with this as well. And they were looking into this and even had wiretaps involved because of her connection to Quaaludes and cocaine. And it's about what she didn't do, right? What she was asked to do and what she actually didn't do. And this also catalyzed the Cook County State's Attorney's Office when she died by this quote-unquote overdose, that they used it as a backdoor way for the state's attorney's office to get involved with the investigation into illegal drug use at the Playboy Mansion, because they were always trying to get Hugh for that. And even at the VIP clubs, they were also looking into him there, but nothing ever stuck. And I think that also has to do with who he knew, who he had blackmail on. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. So Adrienne Pollock applied to be a Playboy bunny, and she actually got tired of living in one of the bunny dormitories. So she moves out and she gets a new place with her boyfriend, Jerry Pingatore, in August of 1773. And she was seen just around the time that she was 23 by a friend during that same year. And then a few weeks later, her family was notified by the police that she had died of an accidental overdose of Quaaludes. So Sandra Theodore, which we'll get deeper into Sandra Theodore. I know I brought her name up a few times a little bit later. And she corroborated with the Quaalude usage, and it was normal for the mansion, and it was used for sex. But you had to be careful of how much you took. And again, according to several Playmates, including Lisa Loving Barrett, it was referred to as leg spreaders by anyone in the mansion, including Hugh Hefner. And she actually said they were a necessary evil, if you will. So these women a lot of times took these drugs to deaden their senses to be able to do these awful things. And you'll see that too, especially with women that are connected to men in power that have Stockholm syndrome to these men in power. They're just going to get hyped up on drugs consistently, so they just don't remember or try to block out the awful things that are happening to them. Now, Adrian's sister Beverly was asked, did she think her sister was trafficking drugs? And she actually said yes. And she believed that Adrian got herself mixed up with the drug trafficking going on at the mansion. And her mother actually never gave up on trying to find out the truth. And what was implied by her sister and Adrian's family was that Adrian was actually a drug mule for Hef. And because of her being a drug mule and her being out on her own outside of the mansion now, that she may have been looked at as a liability, and that the actual overdose wasn't actually an overdose so much as it was an offing, if you will, by possibly Hugh Hefner or someone that worked for Hugh Hefner who was cleaning up the mess. We'll get into Bobby Arnstein. She was executive secretary of Playboy for quite a while for Playboy. She actually was found in a Los Angeles hotel room in January 1975, and she was 34 years old. She was fully dressed, lying in bed, and she left a suicide note written in her typical self-effacing style. The envelope read, "This is another one of those boring suicide notes." As her last act, she penned the letter taking sole responsibility for her death, defending her employer, who she said had been most patient and generous during my recent difficulties. He was a staunchly upright, rigorously moral man. That sounds like a real suicide note, right, guys? And it was Hugh Hefner. And it's actually funny because he's the complete opposite of all that. And so many different theories spun out over the years about who was ultimately responsible for Bobby Arnstein's death. Hefner actually came out and said the harassment of government prosecutors were harassing him. And after she was convicted of drug charges, which they believe was a part of an attempt to take down Playboy by the FBI. And then some people think that she killed herself because she had a depressive episode when 10 years before that, she crashed her car on a stretch of Kentucky highway and she badly injured herself. And also her fiance died as a part of that. And her story is very interesting, how she came up. She wanted to be a playmate, but she didn't look the part to be a playmate. But she ended up becoming his executive secretary. And she was involved in everything from arranging his businesses to letting him know when one of his girlfriends had packed her bags and dumped him. She took care of everything. And they said she was a straight shooter, and she handled all his business, which would also include a lot of negative things and probably covering up a lot of negative things that were going on as a part of the lifestyle that Hugh Hefner was building. So in the 70s, she ends up falling for a Ron Scarf, and he was a drug dealer for 7 years, her junior. So he was a lot younger. As a matter of fact, when she, in this executive role, she actually modeled herself to be the female version of Hugh Hefner. So she always dated guys just tremendously younger than herself. She wanted to emulate Hugh on that other spectrum. But it's also said that she dated Hugh for a while when she first started. So she definitely had relations with Hugh, but she did model herself to be more like a Hugh Hefner, in control and power. And that was kind of her goal. And in 1974, she was actually arrested in front of Playboy Mansion in Chicago for conspiring to transport a half-pound of cocaine from Florida to Chicago, along with her boyfriend Ron and some other men. Her name was all over the newspapers. Even Richard Nixon had Hefner on his enemies list, so nobody knew exactly what was happening. Hugh said it was a witch hunt, that they were coming after him, which they were. They knew there was drugs being pumped all through Playboy. They clearly caught her out there with all of this cocaine. And so what's funny is during the Bobby Arnstein trial, she was actually sentenced to 15 years, which was 5 years longer than any of the men involved, even though the men had way more to do with it. The reason why they did that was they wanted her to flip. They wanted to flip her, so they wanted to put the heat on her by giving her all these years and say, listen, we'll cut all that away. You don't have to do any time at all if you just tell us what happened. Now, the story is that she bucked and she would not tell them. But not long after that, she winds up overdosing in a hotel room with this mysterious suicide note that's praising Hugh Hefner as being one of those moral men ever. So tell me that's not shady. Right? And tell me that's not shady. And of course, Hugh Hefner comes out all teary-eyed, crying. She deserved better than this. She deserved so many other things. And law enforcement is bringing a witch hunt on me. And that's why that she offed herself, was because of all the pressure from the FBI and law enforcement. And no, probably Hugh had something to do with that. I'll be honest with you. And she actually ended her letter with, "It has comforted me to know that this last decision, being of my own choosing, was the only one I felt able to exercise, over which I've had complete control." Interesting way to end it after she praises Hugh for the entire letter, and he's some moral, upstanding citizen. Now we're going to jump to PJ Maston, and she was considered the bunny mother. And she actually received a ton of death threats after the docuseries came out from a bunch of other playmates, which this is the really interesting part about these types of scenarios when I'm breaking them down. And I've noticed it. Not every woman experiences the same thing. They can deal with the same person, but have a completely different experience with that person. Some women could have a fantastic experience. Nothing bad happened to them at all, while other women could have the worst, atrocious things happen to them. That's part of the game. That's knowing who that you can attack and who you don't attack. Because grooming 101 is knowing, hey, this person I'm not going to do something to because I'll get caught. Fight back. They'll go to the police. They'll turn this into a whole thing. They don't mess with those people. And you need a contingent of people who can say, I was treated well. Nothing bad ever happened to me. They basically, some of these women, in my opinion, were considered off limits when it came to a lot of the devious practices that were going on behind the scenes. I think it's important to talk about that too. So she received a bunch of death threats from these other women, and I believe these women didn't have anything bad happen to them. You know, maybe a few did. Who knows? But I would say the majority probably didn't. And they viewed Hugh as this great person. Whereas you had some of these other women, the contingent that did. And these are the women that came forward in this docuseries and in other formats, even through law enforcement over the years. She even said specifically, speaking my truth about Hugh Hefner and his executives have brought an onslaught of vicious verbal attacks against me. Shame on the former bunnies who engage in a mob mentality to silence me. I won't be silenced by anyone, including the women who want to preserve Hefner's legacy for their own self-interest. So some of that, she's right. They have their own self-interest. They didn't want to come forward because they still want to be able to hide under the Playboy Hugh Hefner moniker even after his death. So Maston worked for Playboy from 1972 until 1982. She also accused Soul Train creator Don Cornelius of assaulting two Playboy bunnies, but she also claimed that Playboy bunnies were subjected to humiliating monthly weigh-ins while working at the coveted clubs. So this goes back to, you're a 10, but I'm going to make you feel like you're an 8 or a 7. And I'm going to say, you need to lose 10. Nah, you need to do this. You need to get these implants. You need to get these veneers. You need to do this to better yourself. It's a constant degrading system that he and the other men that were a part of this joined in with when it came to these women. And she was the bunny mother. So she saw all this in, honestly, helped facilitate it, which is super weird too, because that's that fine line, right? Where I am very much in this camp of where's the line drawn? Because women can be coerced and manipulated and basically brought into a system of Stockholm syndrome, and they feel like they can't get out, which I totally agree with that. But then sometimes I'm like, well, you hung around because you wanted to enjoy the benefits that this person was offering you. So you never went forward to the police. You never tried to help. And then after this guy's death, now you come forward. So it's that fine line. And I think it's a bit of both. I think we have to look at some of these women as they were salty and they wanted to come forward because they were salty at Hugh Hefner for whatever reasons, because they didn't get what they wanted. There's some of that, right? Then there's some women who felt empowered to come forward now because he had passed and they didn't feel like there were being repercussions towards them, because obviously there were women that were offed, or at least they perceived to have been offed for coming forward about him. There's that fear too, right? There's the fear of, will they kill me? And we have to put that in the mix too. So it's very complicated. These types of situations are super complicated. And it's always tough for me to say exactly what's going on. And I don't want to speculate too much, because I do think that at the end of the day, this is all Hugh's fault and all of the men he had working with him. And even to some degree, some of the upper tier women that were helping facilitate it. But then there's this level of blackmail and fear that comes along with it. You know, it's easy to say, oh, you could have just went to the police. You could have done this. You could have done better. Not if you're living in fear, right? So again, I think that we have to look at this in a very nuanced way, where I don't want to put too much blame on the Playmates. I want to put all the blame on Hugh for sure, and the other celebrity men that were involved with this. But you have to put some blame on some of the women that were facilitating this too, right? They were enjoying the fruits of their labor. So, but I also don't want to speculate who was doing it, who wasn't, because I don't know. I really don't know these people. I'm only going on the info that I have in front of me. Now, the Los Angeles Times also noted in 2014 that PJ Maston alleged she was once drugged and assaulted by Bill Cosby, which numerous women have come forward with similar claims against the fallen comic. And we're not going to go super deep on Bill Cosby today, because part 2, we're going to talk about some specific, very deep instances of Bill Cosby and his connection to the Playboy Mansion and drugging women. This kind of seems like the MO of these guys, right? They're drugging women and they're having their way with them. And Maston also insisted that Hefner marketed the bunnies to these other men as easy prey for those seeking dominance over these non-consenting women. And part of her role, she said, was to help clean up any scandals involving the bunnies and VIP guests. So Maston wasn't, perfect in this whole thing. She's helping clean up all this stuff. Now, you could say that she was living in fear is why she did it. There's another argument to be made that she was living a pretty good lifestyle. So she might have been doing it to keep that lifestyle up. And at some point she was pushed out. She got salty. And now she's in front of a camera tearing down Hugh Hefner. That doesn't mean that what she's saying not true, though. She just might have different motivations than just, I want to do the right thing. We have to look at these situations as complex, right? It's not cut and dry about why somebody would do something. And as a matter of fact, Maston said that she didn't come forward with the claims earlier because she didn't think anyone would have believed her. Maybe. Well, I'm not going to say it's not true. It's possible that she felt that way. Now, she did say she blames herself, and she said that she has a lot of guilt about not coming forward. But she said she knew that the establishment wouldn't allow me to come forward. And she said, who's going to believe me? Nobody's going to believe me. So she could be telling the truth. And she could have been scared. But again, we have to leave open the possibility that there are other motivations of why she came forward now as opposed to before. So to get to another part of Hugh Hefner and this positivity that he promoted, because again, he had to promote a lot of positivity to be able to do all this negative things behind the scenes. And one of those was to constantly push the civil rights movement and integration of blacks, whites, and all of the races. Again, we talked about this early in the episode where he was doing this in the VIP clubs very early on before any other clubs were doing this. And during the civil rights movement in 1966, Hefner sent Alex Haley, who Alex Haley was an American writer and the author of the 1976 book Roots, the Saga of an American Family, which ABC adapted the book as a television series of the same name, which aired in 1977, and it broke a ton of records. And I think most people have heard of Roots. And Haley also wrote about Malcolm X, and he did a lot of interviews for different magazines. He did some work for Hugh, as a matter of fact, too. And during the civil rights movement in 1966, Haley was sent to interview American Nazi Party founder George Lincoln Rockwell. And Rockwell's shock was that Haley was black. But he agreed to meet with Haley only after gaining assurance that he was not Jewish, although Rockwell kept a handgun on the table throughout the interview. And for people that don't know who George Lincoln Rockwell is, he was an American neo-Nazi activist who founded the American Nazi Party, the ANP, became one of the most notorious white supremacists in the United States until his murder in 1967. His belief strategies and writings have continued to influence many white supremacists and neo-Nazis. He actually coined the expression white power. And anytime I hear white power, I always think about Dave Chappelle's first skit on his first episode of the Dave Chappelle Show, where he played the blind black KKK member. And he kept going, white power, white power. So I always think about that whenever I hear white power. I just think about Dave Chappelle, which is probably a good thing because I actually don't think about how awful white power actually is, which is also the title of his posthumously published political manifesto. And just to give a good basis of what he believed in politics, he regularly praised Adolf, denied the Holocaust, and believed that Martin Luther King Jr. was a tool for Jewish communists, desiring to rule the white community. He blamed the civil rights movement on Jews and viewed most of them as traitors. He viewed black people as a primitive race and supported the resettlement of all African Americans in a new African state to be funded by the U.S. government. So during his career, he never achieved any real power, but his views were very influential on the far right extremist movements such as neo-Nazism and plenty of other ones. And I'm going to take this little part to jump to a little commentary of my own. And I know that sometimes I get backlash from people for stating my opinion on things, but it's my show and that's what I'm supposed to do. And I'm not just going to sit here and spit facts 24/7. If you want facts, you can go to Google or whatever you trust, right? Dig, and you'll find some truth. I'm not sitting here saying that I'm not here to bring you facts. I'm absolutely here to bring you facts and detailed research, but I'm also here to give you my opinion on things. And I think that Rockwell would have been super huge in this day and age, especially right now, especially in the conspiratorial community. All those things I just said about him are literally things that I watch conspiracy theorists praise right now. And part of me understands why, because it goes back to that pendulum theory that I've talked about before, that when the pendulum goes so far one way, and it got extremely left. It went to this entire woke culture and this entire everything's white supremacy, all white people are bad. We're just talking about this part of the left movement. And I don't think everybody that's a part of the left movement thinks this way, but we're talking about the extreme part of it, which is very much showcased in all of media, and it makes you feel like that's all of it, right? So you've got this extremist viewpoint and all of these crazy ideas that come out of it. So what happens is people naturally want to push back. So then they start doing the complete opposite of it in the name of trolling, in the name of, well, if you're going to call me this, I'm going to act like this. So I'm going to start calling people the N-word. I'm going to start saying that every Jew's a problem and start putting all your little emojis down there with the big noses and all of these nasty memes and epithets that you put out on X, and creating this environment of pushback. Well, at least that's what they say, right? And it's all based on exactly what I just said about Rockwell and all these beliefs. But I also think that disguised in that, this quote unquote trolling, is how people really think. And nobody's going to convince me otherwise. And I see a lot of these conspiratorial podcasters out there absolutely saying the most nasty things on the planet, and some of them in the name of Christianity. And it's disgusting to me. And I know that what I'm saying right now in this space is not popular. As a matter of fact, I got called woke by somebody recently for talking about actual racism. I'm talking about the fake racism that's talked about on the left when they're saying everybody's a right-wing extremist and all this craziness, which I think's absolute lunacy too. Let me just say that. Whatever happened to be able to actually having a critical mind and being able to express how you think about something without picking a side? I don't have to pick a side. I got one side that I've picked, and that's God's side. And part of being on God's side is showing love and compassion to all and looking at humanity as humans, not dehumanizing each other. The answer to the left's dehumanization is not to dehumanize on the other end. That's not the answer. It's not. And I'm just absolutely sick and tired of this fake trolling that people say is trolling and quote unquote jokes that people are using in a disguised format of racism, especially from the people who aren't supposed to be acting like that, especially people who say they're Christians. Don't tell me you're a Christian and then you just start calling people the N-word and you start saying all Jews are bad and all this nasty stuff. And right now, there's people right now probably typing in the comments going off. Oh, you're a shell. You're a controlled op. They're all bad. You can't see it. They're all elite. No, I understand completely. There are elite structures in every single country. And when it comes to the J word, there are elites in that are definitely doing some awful things. I don't agree with it. But also, that's a very complex subject. It's not the Jews as a whole. That's not it. That is very surface level, basic BS that you're pushing. Do some extensive research on the subject and understand that there are other parts to that don't make it all. And you're right. I'm going on a little off track here because I got the opportunity to. But it's how I feel. And I'm going to say how I feel because I feel in my heart it's right to do that. And that's why I started this show, was to push back against this absolutely nasty conspiratorial culture of dehumanizing people and creating this environment of living in fear. Just because I don't feed into the woke left's insanity doesn't mean that I don't think that racism doesn't exist. That's ludicrous. You know, I had a guy recently go off on me saying that he had never seen racism in his life and it's only a construct. Yeah, when you live in the backwoods of Kentucky and don't interact with anybody else out in the real world, maybe. But it does exist. It doesn't mean we need to focus on it, but it means that we need to understand that environment has been created and people go through that from all colors, by the way. Even white people deal with racism from other races. I don't think this is a one-way street by any stretch. I think it's all bad. And I think it's abhorrent to watch people who are supposed to be better than this promote this type of ridiculousness. Just like that new Kanye West song that came out a month ago. Heil Hitler. This is being praised by people in the conspiratorial community. Oh, that's so base, dog. That's base, dog. Yeah, he's breaking the matrix. You don't understand what he's doing. He's taking that word away. Bro, if you can't see it for what it is, that it is creating further division, and let's not for a minute act like that Kanye West is helping us break the matrix. That's as stupid as saying Andrew Tate is helping us break the matrix, while in the same breath, They're doing the worst possible things to women. Worst. But they're being praised because they're quote unquote against the system. People eat whatever up, man. And especially Christians. That's the big issue I got a problem with. If you're a doomer, gloomer, black-pilled, you don't believe in any religion, anything, and you think it's all going down, whatever, fine. Now, I'll buy into more of you buying into this crap than someone who claims to be a Christian. When you're supposed to be doing what that Bible says. Show me in that Bible where it says that we're supposed to call people nasty, racially charged names in the name of fighting the system. Show me. I want to see in that book, in that Bible, that you claim is the book you read. You show me that, then I'll listen. Otherwise, I'm going to stand on this soapbox and I'm going to scream it out to the top of my lungs. I'm not going to back down. And I told you guys before that when it comes to love and compassion and building a connectivity with people on this earth, I won't back down from that stuff. And if people don't like it, they don't have to listen to me. There are certain things I will draw the line on. Now, I know I said earlier in the episode, we were talking about Hugh Hefner's lineage, and I said we'd get to some very interesting people that he's related to, presidents. He's actually related to the 41st and 43rd presidents of the United States, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, respectively, which is super interesting. And we know so many things that the Bushes have been involved with or been accused of over the years, many of which I completely agree with. But there's another person that is also related to the Bushes, which would also make him related to Hugh Hefner, would be Barack Obama. He's actually a 10th cousin once removed of George W. Bush. And we know that they're all connected. So then we have to ask the question, with Hugh Hefner's lineage all the way back to the Mayflower and the early power structure within the United States all the way to now, how much of this played into him being in this position to create a honeypot system of blackmail and control? Because I don't think it was just about controlling women. I think it was about blackmail and controlling the men. And I think the CIA was more than likely involved as well. If we're going to suggest that he was the original Epstein, I think absolutely we have to be very open to this idea. And in the second part of this, I will totally expose that part of the story, because we're going to really get into Mark programming. We're going to get into some of these playmates and people involved around him. We'll talk about Bill Cosby. We're going to talk about some really seedy things that went on when it comes to mind control. And if we're going to suggest monarch programming, we have to suggest the CIA, MK Ultra, as being a behind-the-scenes player in this. And today, as we look at some of the things that Hugh was doing, we have to say that this is a huge possibility. Now, another interesting character that pops up when it comes to Hugh Hefner is Charles Manson. As a matter of fact, Sandra Theodore said that Hugh Hefner was obsessed with Charles Manson and owned home videos of the Manson family cult. And Theodore, who dated Hefner from 1976 to 1981, early on in her relationship, found this out. And she said the fascination had to do with Manson's ability, check this out now, to surround himself with and earn loyalty from women in the Manson family. She said, and I quote, "He couldn't talk enough about him. These women have been in jail for how many years, and when they have a chance to get out, they're still adoring him, and they will, until the day they die, wait on him." Hef like that. It's wild to think about that he modeled himself after someone who created a cult like Charles Manson. Photographer Charmaine Leland St. John Silbert said that Hefner's movie collection included Manson family home videos shot before members of the cult committed a series of murders in 1969. So he had actual video footage of Charles Manson and his Manson family. So I'm sure he was watching them and trying to emulate also what Charles Manson did, because he himself created a cult. The Playboy lifestyle was a cult. It was a way to control these women, and not only that, to control these men that were brought in too, without them even knowing it. Now, another woman that's brought up in this docuseries, and this part's very disturbing, but at the same time, it's super important to this, is a Jennifer Saganor, and her father, Dr. Mark Saganor, was a best friend of Hugh Hefner for almost 40 years. And she told the story that she and her father lived at the Playboy Mansion when she was a girl. She said that Hefner and my father were soulmates. In my opinion, this was the love of Hefner's life and the love of my father's life. She said they were actually in a long-term relationship that was spiritual and emotional. Also, physical. We're going to talk about that too. And we do know that Hugh Hefner did come out and say that he was bisexual. So we know that he did delve into the other side of things, which is pretty normal with this type of lifestyle and what these guys promote. You know, I talk a lot about Crowley on the show. Crowley was also bi. So once you go down these roads, especially when it comes to the occult, and when you're just living this quote unquote free lifestyle, you start experimenting with a lot of things. And her father's name that he went by while he was there, his nickname was Dr. Feelgood. He allegedly gave out prescription pills at the Playboy Mansion left and right. He also was able to help facilitate any plastic surgery that the women needed. He did everything. He was the in-house doctor. They did everything for all the women there. And when she was a kid, she didn't really understand the seedy part of it. She just said it was a magical lifestyle. They had exotic animals, gumballs, M&Ms everywhere. When she actually lived there, the butlers made her lunch in the morning. The house limo would drop her off at school. So for her, she was looking at this like, oh, wow, I love this. I want to be like these women too one day. And she was also introduced to drugs very early on. She smoked her first joint in the game room at age 11. What's even crazier, when she was 15, guys, 15 underage, she was forced to get plastic surgery on her chest at 15 by her father and Hugh Hefner. It's wild to even think about something like that being allowed to happen. And when I started digging into Dr. Mark Saganor, I just happened to run across an ex-playmate, a post that she made on Instagram. And this is crazy. She was fighting some people against the fact that this documentary came out, fighting against the daughter who came out and said this. And Peggy Segrin said, "Rest in peace, Mark Saganor. You're one of the first people that I met when I arrived at the Playboy Mansion in 83. You're the first one to treat me as a doctor. It's been so wonderful. I've been friends with you all these years. I'm so glad I got to see you at the wedding and sit and talk with you for a while. I'm sure we will see you again, and Hef is there waiting for you." Yeah, no, I don't think you guys might be hanging together, but I don't think it's going to be in a great place, in my opinion. So Saganor was a big part of this coming out party of what was going on there, and the fact that she was the daughter of Dr. Feelgood, and her coming out saying that Dr. Feelgood and Hugh had a very deep relationship, even physical, all those years. So they were essentially lovers, as well as manipulating, controlling all these women and doing all these awful things to these women. And this is coming straight from the horse's mouth. This is coming from his daughter, who grew up in that home as a small child and saw all this stuff happen. God only knows what happened to her that she's probably not seeing on television. I mean, they forced her to get plastic surgery at 15, which I just think is just absolutely ludicrous. And one of the things, and we're just going to briefly throw out the MK Ultra Monarch programming thing here, but one of the things by Dr. Feelgood facilitating this and Hugh Hefner pushing it, the plastic surgery, the blonde hair for the most part, he wanted them to look like clones. And this actually came out of Holly Madison's mouth. We're going to get into her in a second. But they all wanted them looking alike. And they didn't want them to have their own individuality. If they did something different, they were completely blasted for it. And they were treated awful for doing that. So you had to stick within the confines of what Hugh and the men that worked with him wanted these women to do. So Holly Madison is an American television personality. She's best known as former girlfriend of Hugh Hefner. And if you'll remember that show, The Girls Next Door, she was one of the three girlfriends, and she was the main girl. She also starred in her own reality series, Holly's World, which ran from 2009 to 2011. She released 2 books, Down the Rabbit Hole, in 2015 about her life at the Playboy Mansion and her relationship with Hefner. And she also wrote The Vegas Diaries, Romance, Rolling the Dice, and Road to Reinvention in 2016. And she was actually a pretty low point before she moved into the Playboy Mansion. She had a ton of credit card debt. She was almost homeless. So in 2001, she moved into the Playboy Mansion and officially became one of Hugh Hefner's girlfriends. So obviously they're preying on people who are at the end of their rope too. Here's this beautiful girl. I can mold her. Said then her rope, listen, I'll save you. Just do what I need you to do. Very much in the pimp lifestyle for these types of things to happen. And that's essentially what he was. He was a pimp. And she said that Hefner controlled her finances, enforced a strict schedule and curfew, and denied her opportunities to earn income outside the mansion. And in 2002, all but 2 of his girlfriends left, and Madison became his number 1 girl. And to a point where she even was suggesting to him that she wanted to marry him, have his children. But then later on in 2008, she ended up leaving Hugh. And not long after that, Kendra Wilkinson and Bridget Marquardt ended up leaving as well. And those 3 names are important, especially when it comes to Bridget and Holly Madison, because that's going to get us into the occult aspect of what Hugh Hefner was also doing. And to the point of them looking like clones, Holly Madison actually came out and said that she left the house one day. She went and got her hair cut short. When she came back, Hugh Hefner went off, started calling her old, said she looked hard and cheap, screaming at her. And she was just trying to get a little bit of what she said was individuality. But obviously he didn't want that. He wanted them all to look the same. So if you don't have any individuality, then you become a clone. You become easily controllable. This goes right into Monarch programming, right into MK Ultra. And we have to suggest that because this is what they would be doing, at least on the surface level, right? We don't know behind the scenes how deep this part goes. And I'm going to get into that in episode 2. But just on the surface, getting that angry over a haircut, yeah, there's something more going on to it than just you getting mad at a haircut. So another crazy part, right before Hugh died, he dumped a casket full of private sex tapes into the sea. And this is insiders came out and talked about this. He said he chucked his collection of sex tapes in the Pacific Ocean because he feared that his most famous and secret conquest would be exposed. These insiders said that he gathered up his entire hidden collection of tapes, X-rated photos, and even intimate notes from superstars. He threw them in a specially made casket lined with cement and had his aides dump them in the sea. So nobody really knows where they went. Did they actually go in the sea? Did somebody keep them? It's a form of blackmail against him. We don't know. Hefner's trusted head of security, Joe Piastro, who died in 2011, is believed to have overseen the burial. So this happened probably about 6 years before he died, but he knew he was getting up in age and he wanted to get rid of the stuff. The source said Hugh was terrified of the world finding out everything about his past. He had kept a treasure chest of memories of his life with all these beautiful women dating back from the 1950s to mid-1990s. There was a batch of tape shot on 8mm and Cinefilm, which were filmed during some of the parties. That's the best way I'm going to say it. He enjoyed in the 70s. Some famous male movie stars were in those videos. And if it had come out, it would have been a huge scandal. And this plays right into Hugh documenting everything that happened in the mansion. As a matter of fact, in that documentary, they talk about cameras being everywhere. That during these parties of multiple people, I'm not going to get too explicit here, that he would make sure that he was filming this stuff. Say if it was a male movie star and some sort of playmate, even if he wasn't involved with the process, he'd make sure it's being filmed. He had cameras everywhere. And one of the playmates got super angry at him about it. And he said, "Oh, I'll stop." And then later on, she came back and said, "Hey, I saw you're doing this. I thought you were going to stop. He said, I'm never going to stop. Of course he's not, because he's the precursor to Epstein. He was documenting blackmail that he could use against these men. That I think that there was a major possibility that there was an organization like the CIA that was using Hugh Hefner to do so. And part of the reason that Hugh said he did bury all this stuff was his concern when Pamela Anderson had her tape with Bret Michaels, and then the one that happened when Tommy Lee came out. And that was what sparked his paranoia of his own tapes coming out. And I don't think that was necessarily it. I think a lot of it was blackmail tapes and things that he didn't want getting out. And he was at the point in his life where, and we're going to get in this episode 2, promise, it gets real crazy in episode 2, but I believe that the heat was being put on him behind the scenes for some very awful underage things that he was involved with. And I think this was kind of his kill switch that he buried away, but he knew where it was at and he could always recover if he needed to. A very old school way of doing it, but I think that was a high possibility of what he was doing with those tapes. And to that point of the tapes, the Playmates, well, few said, now as a part of this documentary and a part of some of the interviews that were done, they said that Hugh would bring the men and the women in a room, and sometimes he would just film and direct what was going on. And they would let him because he's Hugh Hefner. But if that doesn't sound like some Epstein stuff to you, I don't know what does. And the Playmates would ask him what he's doing. And he would say, you know me, I'm always filming. And it said he had hidden cameras all through the mansion, even the outside, especially in the grotto area where a lot of other seedy things would happen. Now we're going to get into some of the occult aspects of what Hugh Hefner was very possibly involved with. And to get there, we need to talk about Bridget Marquardt. And she is a podcast host and American television personality known for her role in the reality TV series The Girl Next Door. So she actually has a podcast with Holly Madison called The Girl's Next Level. And on that podcast, they talk about several things. And again, she was part of the Girlfriends with Kendra Wilkinson during the television show, The Girl Next Door. And Kendra Wilkinson literally wants nothing to do with them now. They don't get along with her. But Bridget and Holly have talked about quite a few interesting things on their podcast when it comes to some very seedy things that could have been going on behind the scenes. They allude to some things, but they're very careful about what they say. And they keep it very light. They try to keep it very positive, but they do talk about some seedy things. And one of those was this Midsummer's Night's Dream party. And they all dressed up like these characters from Midsummer's Night Dream. And this is actually episode 27 called Grooming the Audience. And they actually talk about how they think that the entire show was trying to groom the audience into this perversion. And this party took place in 2005. Now, the very interesting thing that's brought up, Bridget talks about this mural where Hefner was painted as the god Pan, which that in and of itself opens up a floodgate. So for people that don't know who Pan is a Greek god of the wild, shepherds and flocks, rustic music and impromptus, and companion of the nymphs. He has the hindquarters, legs, and horns of a goat in the same manner as a faun or satyr. With his homeland in rustic Arcadia, he's also recognized as the god of fields, groves, wooded glens, and often affiliated with sex. Because of this, Pan is connected to fertility in the season of spring. In Roman religion and myth, Pan was frequently identified with Faunus, a nature god who was the father of Bonadea, sometimes identified as Fauna. He was also closely associated with Sylvanus due to their similar relationships with woodlands, and Inuus, a vaguely defined deity, also sometimes identified with Faunus. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Pan became a significant figure in the Romantic movement of Western Europe and also in a 20th century neo-pagan movement. And you'll always see Pan show up in so many different pagan rituals, and the goat-headed god, right? The sex god. He's always shown in art with having his phallus present. That's very important to it. Also playing a flute as well, almost like the Pied Piper. And the worship of Pan began in Arcadia, which was also the principal seat of his worship. Arcadia was a district of mountain people, culturally separated from other Greeks. Arcadian hunters used to scourge the statue of the god if they had been disappointed in the chase. And being a rustic god, Pan was not worshipped in temples or other built edifices, but in natural settings, usually caves or grottos, such as the one on the north slope of Acropolis of Athens. So he was generally considered more of a wooded god that was worshipped by the mountain people. And that's important too, because Pan shows up a lot here in the States, specifically in the Appalachian mountain ranges. Talk to a lot of people up there, talk about the old gods, and Pan's one of those. And the more we dig into cryptids and cryptid research, I have found Pan show up a lot when it comes to these entities that are trying to manipulate and harass people in the woods. Pan is one of those. Now, I do think that entities will masquerade as said gods and mimic each other too, but I think Pan is a central figure when it comes to the mountain ranges. And that even is very prevalent here in the United States as well. And Herodotus, who, if you remember, when I did the episode about the cynocephali, I talk about Herodotus a good bit there, and he's a Greek historian and geographer from the Greek city of Halicarnassus, and he wrote a book called Histories. And in that book, Histories, he talks a lot about a lot of different creatures. And one of those creatures that he talks about are the satyr. And he mentions them as a tribe of Thracians who lived in freedom and inhabited mountainous regions. They're also known as excellent warriors and were involved in gold and silver mining. Herodotus also associates them with an oracle of Dionysus located on their highest mountains. Now, it's really funny because people will call him the father of lies while other people call him the father of history. And he was criticized early on for his inclusion of legends and fanciful accounts. However, a sizable portion of the histories has since been confirmed by modern historians and archaeologists. So it's funny. They said he was making up all this stuff. So then later, as more modern historians start digging through it, like, wait a minute, that's true, that's true, that's true, that's true. Okay, so the fanciful stuff, quote unquote, we got to start taking more as what he saw in reality. And he said he did. He said he saw these things. He said, I don't know what these people are talking about. I'm not making this up for entertainment. I always reported what I saw. So these dog-headed men, these satyrs, all these different, what we consider cryptids now, he was running into. And he wrote that according to Egyptian chronology, Pan was the most ancient of gods. But according to his version, in which Pan was the son of Hermes and Penelope, he was born only 800 years before Herodotus and thus the Trojan War. Herodotus concluded that that would be when the Greeks first learned the name of Pan. So it kind of ties into these satyr that he was also talking about. So here we got a guy who's, according to modern historians, have said his Histories book, most of it's true. So then we got to consider that a lot of the talk about gods and all these other cryptids were actually real too. And to Pan, one of the most famous myths involves the origin of the Pan flute. It was fashioned from links of hollow reed. So Syrinx was a lovely wood nymph of Arcadia, daughter of Ladon, the river god. She was returning from the hunt one day, and Pan met her. To escape from his advances, the fair nymph ran away and did not stop to hear his compliments. He pursued from Mount Lycaeum until she came to her sisters, who immediately changed her into a reed. When the air blew through the reeds, it produced a plaintive melody. So he's super infatuated with Syrinx. He's trying to get her. He realized that she's become a reed, but he can't identify which reed she became. So he cuts 7 pieces. Some versions, they say it's 9. And he joins them side by side in decreasing lengths until he creates his instrument, and he gives it the name of Syrinx. And then after that, he was never seen without it. So this is why you always see him with the pan flute, what they call the pan flute. Also, this also ties right into the Playboy Mansion and this pan imagery of Hugh Hefner. Women who have sexual relations with many men are also referred to as pan girls. So I thought that was fascinating too, that here you have the god Pan. And if you're on YouTube right now, you're going to see the mural, because I'm going to put it up here, of Hugh Hefner looking like Pan. I find it fascinating. And this also ties even deeper into the occult too. We've talked about Crowley's Night of Pan and the city of the pyramids, where he goes there to kill the ego, and he is rebirthed into becoming this ascended version to become a secret chief himself. So there are so many different tie-ins to Pan, but the fact that he's putting himself out there on a mural as Pan, I thought was a big tell. Now, another story that's interesting, and Holly Madison talks about this, he takes them all to see Beowulf, the 2007 animated film. I don't know if you guys ever seen that or not. I remember watching it. I enjoyed it to some extent when I saw it. It's like stop motion. It's this mix of CGI. It kind of looks real. It had a lot of actors and actresses you know. Anthony Hopkins was in it, Angelina Jolie, Crispin Glover, John Malkovich, a bunch of different people that you know, right? And they all voice act all of these different characters. So he takes them to see this movie. And Holly Madison says she remembers it vividly. And in the movie, she said when Grendel shows up, he almost looks identical to Hugh Hefner. And so I had to pull it up because I remember seeing the movie. I was like, let me go look at this real quick. And I'm like, oh my God, he kind of looks like Hef. And if you're on YouTube or Rumble, I'm putting it up right now. And I have Hugh and Grendel side by side so you can see them. And she kind of freaked out. And she said she felt like that they modeled Grendel after Hugh. And that's why Hugh wanted to take them to the movie. Now, he never outright said it, but she said it was weird, and she felt like they modeled Grendel after Hugh. So let's look at Grendel. Let's see the significance of Grendel. Now, he's a part of this epic poem Beowulf from 700 to 1000 AD. He's one of the poem's three antagonists, along with his mother and the dragon, and they're all lined up in opposition against Beowulf, and he's referred to as a Jotun. And we'll get into Jotun here in a second. But he's described as the descendant of the biblical Cain and a creature of darkness, exiled from happiness and accursed of God, the destroyer and devourer of our humankind. He is usually depicted as a monster or giant, although his status as a monster, giant, or other form of supernatural being is not clearly described in the poem and thus remains the subject of scholarly debate. But he is said to be from the lineage of the biblical Cain, and he's tied in to giants. So that's super interesting. And him being cursed as a descendant of a biblical Cain is also in conjunction with elves and Jotuns, which is in Germanic mythology. And I believe I talked about the Jotun in the troll episode I did with Cryptids of the Corn. So go back there and listen to that. We get into the Jotun a little more detailed, but you can tie them into trolls. You can tie them into the Nephilim. They're in that pantheon of these types of giants. And most people translate Jotun to giant, even though it's not technically the terminology for it, but that's basically the English iteration of it. So Grendel is in opposition of Beowulf. And really how that starts is he attacks Heriot and he continues to attack the hall. So the king, Hrugar, brings in Beowulf, and Beowulf and his warriors come in, stay in the mead hall where Grendel is consistently attacking. And it's a long story, but long story short, he ends up killing Grendel and his mother, and Beowulf is obviously the hero of the tale. But Grendel is, for all intents and purposes, a representation of the descendants of Cain, this cursed line, this Nephilim line. Now, that's interesting that Holly Madison is saying that she believes that in that movie, they modeled what Grendel looked like after Hugh Hefner. And if we're going to suggest some of these occult things happening behind the scenes, well, we have to suggest that there's more than meets the eye. We already talked about his lineage. We talked about who he's related to. Weirdly enough, the Bushes and Obama. And his lineage can be tracked all the way back to the Mayflower. So what is his bloodline? Why was he put in this position? Was he the first Epstein? We have to ask these questions. And I'm not saying it's a fact. This is me going on my speculative part. You know how I like to do on the show. But there's enough circumstantial evidence that we can say, oh, there's something to this. It's weird. And another thing that Holly and Bridget talk about is the unfinished space of the mansion. And when they walked down there, they found an altar. They said it was really weird. There were petals burned. There was some other weird stuff they couldn't remember. They actually asked one of the guys that worked there about it, and he laughs and makes a joke about it and then moves on. And as they're talking to each other, they're trying to remember, but they can't really remember. And it starts making me think that how many of these girls were a part of some sort of monarch programming where even the ones that feel like that they had good times while they were at the mansion or as a playmate or working for Hugh Hefner, how much of that was scrubbed from their memory? If we're going to suggest that he's the original Epstein, we have to. And I think that's a good place to stop today because next week we're going to go really deep in on the monarch programming angle and what some of these women were involved with and just really some of the weird stuff. We're going to get into the pig parties. I know I brought that up early on. We're going to talk about in depth what some of the Playmates were connected to when it came to this type of MK Ultra called monarch programming. And we're also going to talk about some very, very sordid accusations that were pushed on Hugh Hefner right around the time he died. So we're going to really look at what the government had on him, what he was suggesting he might do, and then I'm going to talk about what I think may have happened to him when he died, because I personally don't think it happened the way they're telling us. But I really appreciate you guys joining me for another episode. Can't wait to give you part 2 next week so we can really flesh out who Hugh Hefner was and what he did. Again, guys, I really appreciate everyone that's been going to give 5-star reviews on the show. Please, if you haven't given a 5-star review and you've been listening to the show, please go give one. If you're on Apple, go write a nice review with the 5-star. It takes 30 seconds to a minute of your day, and it helps the show grow. I find it fascinating where people will follow the show and they won't give a 5-star review, which is super easy. And I get it, we're all busy, and I'm not attacking anybody, but I'm saying if you got 30 seconds, go give a 5-star review right now. Do it while I'm talking to you. It helps the show grow. It helps it get deeper in the algorithm. Also, if you're not following the show, go hit the follow button on Apple or Spotify right now, because that also helps the show grow. If you're on YouTube and haven't subscribed yet, go subscribe. It's crazy. I'll get all these views sometimes on the show, and the subscribe count doesn't go up very much. And I know that it'll get a huge influx of comments. People are loving it. And it always makes content creators wonder, just hit the subscribe button. Hit the notifications. That way you know when the next show's coming. Share the show. That's another big one too. Share the show. If you enjoy it, share it. Again, all the people that have done it, appreciate you so much. People that haven't, if you enjoy it, obviously, go give a 5-star review. If you don't like it, I would probably suggest just move on. That's what I do when I don't like stuff. So it is what it is. But I love you guys to death. And you guys have been following me we're rolling up on a year now, guys. Here in a few weeks, we're going to be at a year. And I'll let you guys know when we've actually been doing this for a year. But I love all you free range rabbits. You've been fantastic. On the way out, we're going to play PSYOP today. think it's a good song to play in conjunction with this deep dive on Hugh Hefner. You know what it is, guys. Go outside, touch grass, and get your tail out the hole.